Welcome and thank you for tuning in to our Chester Juneteenth celebration virtual commemoration. Today's speaker is Dr. Chika Akua. Please sit back and listen to our rich history about Juneteenth. Once again, thank you for tuning in. Feel free to like, comment, and share below. Thank you.
Greetings, peace, and blessings, family. My name is Dr. Chika Akua. And as I often speak around the country, I always like to begin with what time it is. And there's a great African-American educator and scholar by the name of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who said, "It's 11:59 on the clock of destiny. And life is like a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon you, can't refuse it. Didn't seek it, didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You'll suffer if you lose it. Give account if you abuse it. It's only a minute, but eternity is in it. And with that minute, you, me, and we, everybody that's watching this broadcast, can change and transform the world." Let me say to you, happy Juneteenth, and thank you for logging on, and thank you for tuning in. I promise what you're about to see is going to change and transform your life. I'm going to load up my PowerPoint here because my images are going to be very important for you to understand what I'm going to be sharing about today. My name is Dr. Chika Akua, and I'm very pleased to share this message with you today. A little bit about my background. I've been in education for over 25 years now, and I've been traveling around the country to urban schools, educational conferences, colleges, and universities. And we teach teachers how to bring out the brilliance in our children, because many of our children are in schools and school systems where they're seen as a problem rather than as people. And so we train teachers and leaders and counselors and parents on how to bring out the brilliance within our children. And I'm a former language arts teacher. Middle grades is where I spent most of my time. Did some in elementary and some at the high school level as well. Right now, I currently serve as an assistant professor of educational leadership at Clark Atlanta University, one of our wonderful and illustrious HBCUs. So with that being said, what you're going to hear in just a few moments about the celebration of Juneteenth and the history behind it is so powerful that I want you to make this a global experience for other people. So if you see something or hear something that you think is interesting and that other people need to know, please make sure you share this video with other people, because we got to circulate the message, all right? You know, it's customary that whenever African people gather together, that we begin by giving honor to the Most High, who is known by many names and worshiped in many ways, certainly the one source and the one force through which we all live, move, and have our being. But you know, there's also a custom amongst African people that we honor our ancestors, because there's an African proverb which says, if we stand tall, it is because we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors. Or as Dr. Jacob Carruthers has said, indeed our stride is wide because we're walking in the footsteps of giants. And so, brothers and sisters, as we watch this, I want you to gather your family around, because you've heard it said before that a picture is worth what? It's worth 1,000 words, right? Well, what I'm going to share with you today, as you can see, this is a very visually driven presentation, and the pictures will make a big difference in it. So as the great poet Lister Bell Middleton has said, sharpen your eye and tune your ear so you know what you see and understand what you hear. So let's go ahead and get into it. But before we do, wait a minute. Let me give you a warning, because what I'm about to share with you is literally going to blow your mind. And I want you to know that up front, because what I'm about to share with you is not for the faint at heart. What I'm about to share with you here on ABC, NBC, CBS, C-SPAN, or CNN, what I'm about to share with you has been intentionally kept from you, and we're going to find out why in just a moment. Let's talk about Juneteenth, our African American Independence Day. Let's get it. Before we have any conversations about what people refer to as slavery, it is very important that you understand that there was a time when Black people led the world in wealth creation, literary production, and scientific innovation. Now, brothers and sisters, I don't know if you've heard me speak before, but those that have know I go in deep on that. I have an entire series of African origins presentations where I use visual documentation to show you everything that we created in all areas of human endeavor. Everything from reading and writing and language and literature, mathematics and medicine, architecture and engineering, science and technology, and much, much more. Black people led the world in wealth creation, literary production, and scientific innovation. We had the great empires of Nubia, Kush, and Kemet in East Africa. And when we had the great empires of Ghana and Mali and Songhai in West Africa, we had a rich tradition that we were intentionally cut off from. And you're going to see why in just a moment. Because after we built these amazing things and people from all over the world came to study at the feet of our ancestors, and they never referred to us as the N-word. But then came the Ma'afa, the long night of our suffering. Ma'afa is a Swahili term which refers to the catastrophic interruption of African sovereignty and civilization. Slavery is not Black history, it's been said. Slavery is not Black history, it interrupted Black history. The Ma'afa is the catastrophic interruption of African sovereignty and civilization. Sovereignty meaning we were recognized throughout the world as a powerful people. But the Ma'afa interrupted all of that. And that led us into what we today would refer to as slavery. But we prefer to use the term Ma'afa because if you say slavery, you say, oh, well, that started in 1619 and then it ended at the end of the Civil War in 1863. But the thing that you need to understand about the Ma'afa is it's still going on. The suppression, the oppression, the lynching, the disenfranchisement, the terrorism, the Ma'afa is still going on. So don't get it twisted. That's why we tend not to use the word slavery, at least in the intellectual and spiritual tradition that I've been blessed to come through, okay? And so one thing that you need to understand when we talk about the Ma'afa, when we talk about the enslavement of African people, is that we never laid down and allowed ourselves to be enslaved. It's very important that you understand this, okay? There were Africans called Maroons. And these Maroons, these were Africans who refused to be enslaved. And they overthrew their captors. And they went up into the swamps of North Carolina and in the low country of South Carolina. They went up into the hills and in the mountains. They went up into the swamps of Georgia and Florida and built entire Maroon encampments. They went down into Mexico and in Central and South America and established entire Maroon nations. You have never probably heard this history before. The word Maroon comes from the Spanish word cimarron, which means wild cow, because that is how the Spanish and others viewed Africans who refused to be slaves. So one of the things that we have not been taught is our resistance history. And the little bit that we have been taught, you may have heard the names of Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser. I hope you've heard about the Stono Rebellion. I hope you've heard about the Haitian Revolution. If you haven't, please go and watch the outstanding documentary entitled 1804. But here's something I need for you to understand. A scholar by the name of Herbert Aptheker documented over 250 revolts of captive Africans. Over 250. That means at least once a year during the times of our captivity, we were revolting. As a matter of fact, my research has demonstrated that we were always either planning a revolt, in the midst of a revolt, or coming out of a revolt. One more time, family. We were always either planning a revolt, in the midst of a revolt, or coming out of a revolt. We never laid down and accepted our enslavement. It's very important that we understand that. And then so many of us began to escape slavery, not to mention those that would intentionally burn down their crops of their master, or maybe I should say slave monster instead of master, because it was a morally monstrous act of genocide that was imposed upon African people. And so there were those captive Africans who would intentionally burn down the crops of the slave monster. There were those that would grind up glass and put it in the food of the slave monster. You haven't heard this history before, brothers and sisters. Let me tell you. And these, among other things, and the agitators and the abolitionists led to the Civil War. And what I'm doing is I'm laying the foundation so you'll understand why Juneteenth is so very important to us as a people, okay? And the Civil War took place between 1861 and 1865. And as you look at this map here, and I'm trying to teach this and break this down so that even the youngest child can understand it. America, through the Civil War, had become separated between the North and the South. The North is represented by the blue states, and the North was referred to as the Union. The red states in the South were referred to as the Confederacy. Now, the Confederacy wanted to secede or separate from the Union. They wanted to leave the United States of America because they wanted to maintain slavery. And they felt so strongly about it that they said, you know what, y'all are trying to abolish slavery in the North. We want to keep slavery. We like slavery. And so they decided that they would form their own little nation. And instead of having to send cotton and other resources up to the North to be processed in the mills, they said, look, we'll send our cotton directly to Europe, directly to England, and we'll keep that profit and stop going through the North, which was the middleman. Okay, so this was like a serious fight. And as most things in America, it all boiled down to the almighty dollar. But there were several border states, and the border states you can see are red and blue. The border states of Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, these were states that were in the Union, but they still had slavery. And that's going to be very important for what I'm about to share with you in just a second. Now, you must remember that Frederick Douglass was agitating and speaking all over the country about the need to abolish slavery. So much so that it got the ear and the attention of President Abraham Lincoln. And even back in the 1800s, when no black man was allowed in the White House other than to be a butler or a servant, somehow he had captivated the attention of Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things that Frederick Douglass said is that power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Power will never relinquish its power without those that are not in power making a demand upon it. And so Frederick Douglass was constantly letting Abraham know, look, this war is serious and you need to let black soldiers fight. You need to let black men fight in this war. Well, an interesting thing happened. Abraham Lincoln turned him down on several occasions. But something very interesting happened. In the process, the Union, which is the North, was getting slaughtered by the South. They thought that this little war between the states would only last a few months, but the South, the Confederacy, was coming on strong, and they were putting a whooping on Union forces. And so Abraham Lincoln had to say, well, wait a minute, Frederick Douglass, I think you might be onto something. I think we may need to let these colored men fight. Frederick Douglass's insistence on black men being commissioned to fight in the Civil War eventually led Lincoln to authorize the use of African troops or black troops in July of 1862. And once he did that, the tide of the war slowly and then quickly began to shift, because according to the testimony of Confederate white soldiers, they said fighting a black soldier, one black soldier, is like fighting 10 white soldiers. Yeah, that probably wasn't in the history books that you learned from. And so on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, he's given a lot of credit for this. He's called the great liberator, the great emancipator, because the Emancipation Proclamation set free captive Africans in the Confederate States. But wait a minute. Guess what? It did not free the over 500,000, count them, 500,000 Africans in the Union's border states of Kentucky, Missouri, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So let's get the record straight. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free all captive Africans. You notice I'm not using the term slaves, because when you just call them slaves, you deculturalize and dehumanize them once again. These were people. These were African people. We want to know the culture from which they came, because cultural genocide was attempted upon our people. So we don't refer to them as slaves. We refer to them as captive Africans, or you could say enslaved Africans. We want to keep Africans there so that we're in touch and in tune with our culture. Okay? So with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, a number of captive Africans were set free, but not all of them. And of course, what did they do? They rushed to the North to help fight on the side of the Union. So here are the border states where there was some conflict and where there were captive Africans who were not set free. But take a look at these Black Civil War soldiers. Man, hold on. Let's get a close-up look at the look on those brothers' faces. You see, in the mind of those brothers, they weren't just fighting in a war between the states. They were fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for the freedom of themselves and those that they loved. So there was a greater sense of leverage. There was a greater sense of urgency in their hearts and minds and spirits and souls in terms of their fighting. And that's why the Confederate soldiers said fighting one of these brothers was like fighting 10 white men. But it wasn't just the brothers. Hey, take a look at Araminta Harriet Tubman. She was a Union spy. She didn't just stop working on the Underground Railroad, taking all of these captive Africans to freedom. Once the Civil War started, she became a Union spy, going behind enemy lines and doing the work that was necessary. And so finally, the end of the Civil War came. The African soldiers, the Black soldiers, turned the tide of the Civil War. And at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865, the decision was made and the Confederate States surrendered. And it was officially the end of the Civil War, the end of the long night of our oppression as a people. Or so we thought. There was another battle and several others after that had to be waged to secure our rights. Interesting thing happened. The word had gone out that the war was over, but the word didn't make it to all the captive Africans. As a matter of fact, there were thousands of Africans in the state of Texas who didn't receive word until 2 years later. Now, there's some discrepancy as to why that happened. Historians have suggested that a messenger had been sent to let the captive Africans know in the state of Texas, but that person, that messenger, had been killed. Okay? And so that's one of the stories that has been circulating. But what we do know is that on June 19th, 1865, Union Major General Gordon Granger issued the military order at Galveston, Texas, freeing the captive Africans. General Order Number 3. The people of Texas are now informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, the president, all slaves are set free. That's their language. We would say captive Africans. But it was 2 years later. Can you imagine that? The slave monsters kept the captive Africans in ignorance of the fact that they were actually free for 2 years. which begs a question that Dr. Amos Wilson asks in the book, The Falsification of African Consciousness. Why is it the final arbiters of truth are the very people who lie to us the most? For some of us in our community, we don't believe it until other folks tell us that it's true. For some people in our community, we still believe other folks' ice is colder and other folks' sugar is sweeter. We don't believe it until we hear somebody that doesn't look like us tell us the truth. Why is it that the final arbiters of truth, the final judges of truth, are the very people who have lied to us the most? Something for us to think about. And the lessons that I'm teaching you about, if you've never heard it before, how come you never heard it? Why isn't it in the history books in the way that it should be? You know, we're living in some very revolutionary times. And the arbiters of truth that don't look like us continue to suppress information that could set us free. I love this meme. It's a meme of law enforcement officials saying, we investigated ourselves and cleared ourselves of any wrongdoing. Well, if you're watching this right now, you know we're living in some revolutionary times, some seriously revolutionary times. And you have to ask yourself, who do you rely on for information? Do you really think you're going to find out what we need as a people by tuning into any of these networks? Now, I'm not saying don't watch the news, but I question the name of it. Is it really the news, or is it the same old stuff every day, circulating every day amongst these different news systems, but never giving us the true information that we need to secure our true freedom? And right now, I think it's safe to say that we have surpassed the level of violence, the level of vitriolic attacks upon Black people in America, I believe has now surpassed the 1950s and 60s. You know, I always used to look back to the 50s and 60s and say, man, that was the quintessential period where, you know, the civil rights movement and then the Black Power movement came along right after that. And it just seemed like, man, it couldn't get any worse than that. But now I think we have surpassed, in terms of the violence that we're experiencing as a people, we have surpassed what we've seen in the 50s and 60s. Or maybe we haven't surpassed it. As Will Smith said, it's not that it's worse, it's just that it's being recorded. And, you know, the ones that have been recorded, there are thousands that haven't been recorded, acts of brutality. Now, if you're learning something and you like what you've heard so far, brothers and sisters, and you want to stay in contact and you know that you need to get this kind of information and more for yourself and for your children, I want you to take a picture of your screen. And when I'm finished, you can do this. Text Dr. Akua to 22828. Text Dr. Akua, DRAKUA, to 22828. And that will put you in our database. Okay, it's going to ask you to put in your email address. And then I can send you an email blast from time to time. I promise I won't spam you, but I will send you an email from time to time letting you know when I'm doing lectures and when I'm doing presentations and where I am around the country when things open back up after COVID-19. But we have a number of resources that we can share with you to keep you and your family informed with these little known Black history facts that have intentionally been kept from us. Imagine that. Forced ignorance kept captive Africans from knowing for 2 years that they had been set free. And forced ignorance is keeping us today from knowing the truth about our history and culture and what could make us free today. Here's a couple of other brothers who are doing some powerful work in this area. I highly recommend the work that they're doing. Dr. Boyce Watkins with Your Black World and Michael Imhotep with the African History Network. You got to check these brothers out. They do amazing research and have an amazing way of presenting the research to give you up-to-date information on a daily basis. So I want you to check them out. Go online and Google them. Michael Imhotep, African History Network, Dr. Boyce Watkins, Your Black World. They're keeping us informed, and they are meticulous researchers, as you will see when you check them out. And I like to think that I have a pretty high standard in terms of my research as well. And so, brothers and sisters, after the Civil War, something very interesting happened. Major General William T. Sherman of the Union forces marched through Atlanta and did his historic march to the sea. And on January 16th, 1865, he released Special Field Order 15. Boy, if Black people knew about Special Field Order 15. Oh my goodness. Do your research. I'm about to share a little bit of it with you right now. Special Field Order 15 said the islands from Charleston, South Carolina, south, the abandoned rice fields along the river for 30 miles back from the sea, and the country bordering the St. Johns River in Florida are reserved and set apart for the settlement of the Negroes now made free by the acts of war. Let me tell you what this means. 30 miles back from the sea? Here's a map of the United States. What Sherman's order, Field Order 15, was saying, that where you see this red circle, all of that land from the coast inland 30 miles from Charleston, South Carolina, all the way down to Florida was supposed to belong to Black people. What is that land now? That land now is prime real estate, where there are hotels, where there are resorts and spas, and where multi-millions, if not billions of dollars are made every single year. And to my peeps in South Carolina, I just want you to know that I see you, because we've vacationed in South Carolina before. We love going to Beaufort and to Hilton Head and those areas. And one of the things I like to say is that if you've never been to Africa and you can't get to the islands of the Caribbean and you want to learn about African culture, the next best place to go is the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, because the African cultural continuity was kept in place. And we know that many of our brothers and sisters, even today, are having their land taken from them. Land that has been in their family for generations in South Carolina and on the coast of Georgia. Land being taken away from them by real estate developers. Just this gets really deep. So again, to give you another visual of this, Special Field Order 15, imagine how much land that is. And if we had been allowed to keep that land, what we would have been able to do with it. See, this is why it's so very important that you know your history, because you won't know what kind of demands to make when your history has been kept from you. This entire region was supposed to be ours. On the islands and in the settlements hereafter, here's what Sherman says, hereafter to be established, no white person whatever, unless military officers or soldiers detailed for duty, will be permitted to reside, and the sole and exclusive management of affairs will be left to the freed people themselves. We were supposed to be ruling that entire area. But then, after President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson came into office. And President Andrew Johnson overturned Sherman's directive in the fall of 1865. After the war had ended, and returned most of the land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coast to the slave owners who had originally owned it. Just took it right out of the hands of the newly freed Africans and gave it right back to the slave masters. And this is why you have to be very, very clear, as my good friend and colleague Michael Imhotep says, elections have consequences. Elections have consequences. We just heard about a policy that was to put thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of acres into the hands of Black people, and it was overturned in the twinkling of an eye. Elections have consequences. This is why it's so very important that we have to understand the difference between reform and reparations. Reform is reconstituting everything that was going on before, which was not working. And we don't want to go back to what was normal before. Reparations means that there is a debt that is owed to us and that it must be paid. Now, brothers and sisters, please don't fall for the okie doke. We love the fact that the sister mayor in DC had Black Lives Matter painted on the street for all to see. That's a beautiful and wonderful thing. We love the fact that Confederate statues of the white terrorist generals are now being taken down. That's beautiful and that's wonderful. As a matter of fact, I'm told, as I've done some research and looked in the newspapers and things, that even Nike and Twitter and Square have determined that Juneteenth will be a company holiday for them. All of that is great and wonderful. If you go on to Amazon's webpage, you will see that they have something that says Black Lives Matter. Same thing with Netflix. All of those things are wonderful. Even Hennessy, I think I've read, is donating $3 million, towards the efforts. All of that is fine. But guess what? That's not enough. Don't fall for the okie doke. All of these are symbolic types of things. It's great to have Black Lives Matter painted on the street. It's great to have the Confederate statues taken down. It's great to make Juneteenth a company holiday, but we want and demand more. Very, very important. And that's why we have to talk about reparations. So when we talk about reparations, that is that there is a debt that is due to us. You must beware, because all kinds of well-meaning people will be speaking out saying, oh, this is terrible what has happened to Black people. Black Lives Matter and different things about that. But beware of non-economic liberalism. Beware of non-economic liberalism. What does that mean? That is white liberals who will say, oh, this is terrible. That never should have happened. And we need to do something about that. But then when it comes time to open the checkbook, nothing happens. And if they do open the checkbook, they throw a few crumbs and expect us to be placated and pacified by that. No, reparations requires much more. And we're not talking about a check that every Black person would receive necessarily, but we're talking about the fact that, hey, maybe student loans need to be completely expunged and abolished. How about that? Hello. How about tax debts be expunged and abolished? How about that? How about free scholarships to college? And how about properly funding our HBCUs and have annual federal appropriations to our HBCUs? Okay. See, these are the types of things that we need to be thinking about. How about we have funding to train up a new generation of teachers and leaders to teach our students in our cultural best practices of education rather than engaging in miseducation? How about training up a new generation of counselors and therapists and psychologists who have been trained in our healing modalities as it relates to mental health, so that we can begin to deal with the intergenerational unaddressed trauma that has racked the Black community? We need training, we need scholarships, we need appropriations for all of those things. How about we get federal appropriations to build Black businesses and Black communities? How about housing? See, all of these things need to take place when we talk about reparations. We're not talking about just giving Black people a check right now. Matter of fact, we don't want every Black person to get a check. Because in your current state of mind, the money will be back into the hands of white folks before the weekend is out. And y'all know that I'm telling the truth. So be careful of non-economic liberalism, people who talk about the problem but don't want to do anything about it. And by the way, when we talk about reparations, did you know that white slave owners received reparations after the Civil War? Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, our sister, Dr. Tara W. Hunter, a professor at Princeton, broke the story in the New York Times that after President Abraham Lincoln signed the bill to emancipate enslaved people, interestingly enough, the District of Columbia Emancipation Act paid those loyal to the Union up to $300 for every enslaved person freed. That's right. Slave owners got reparations. Enslaved African Americans got nothing for their generations of stolen bodies, snatched children, and expropriated labor other than their mere release from legal bondage. Oh, we got some demands that we need to make. And right now, as I'm speaking, America is on fire. You know, we've looked with great disdain and disgust at the national murders of Ahmaud Arbery, of Breonna Taylor, of the knee on the neck of George Floyd, of Rashard Rashard Brooks being killed. And all of these things have been recorded for everyone to see. What more evidence do we need? And so we have some serious demands that we need to make. And so I want you to be very careful about those who appear to be on our side. Malcolm X said, a man who tosses worms in the river isn't necessarily a friend of the fish. Beware of the non-economic liberalism. People who say, oh man, that's so bad, that's so terrible, what happened, that should never have happened. Save your tears. Pay the debt that's due. Man who tosses worms into the river isn't necessarily a friend of the fish. And you got all of these corporations who are trying to pivot and do something to make it look like they care. No, the demand is reparations. And that's what we must be talking about. The other thing that we have to be careful about is to understand, I think we probably all agree that the leadership coming out of the White House is not what we would like to see, at least most of us anyway. But because we focused on the snake, we missed the scorpion. There's an African proverb that says, because we focused on the snake, we missed the scorpion. There's a scorpion down in the bottom right-hand corner. And you better understand it'll sting you just as bad and kill you just as good as a snake. So be very, very clear who we're dealing with. And brothers and sisters, if I can make it real plain, I don't think that we have thoroughly explained to our children who we're dealing with. And the fact that our dealings with this nation and with European nations have always resulted in one of five things: deception, division, destruction, disease, and death. One more time: deception, division, destruction, disease, and death. These are the five things that have occurred anytime African people and indigenous people around the world have had encounters with European people. Take it or leave it, but we need to be clear and we need to be honest with our children. As I close, we need to find the balance between protest and production. Protest is important. Protest is necessary. I'm so thankful to all of the wonderful brothers and sisters that were in the streets, who raised a black fist, who protested and made their voices known and their presence known. But how do we find the balance between protest and production? How do we cultivate a climate of production of the things that make us more self-sufficient and less vulnerable to white terrorism? We have to produce, brothers and sisters. I'd be very interested to find out what you think about this presentation. And if you like what you've heard, before I give these recommendations, jot down my email address, drakua@drakua.net, drakua@drakua.net. Send me an email. Let me know what you think, okay? But as I close, I have a few recommendations for us. The first thing we got to do is we got to buy black. One way that we can all do that by becoming an official supporter, go to buyblackmovement.com. You will see hundreds of products, all made and manufactured by Black producers. So we got to buy black. Go to buyblackmovement.com. Become an official supporter where you're buying things every month. Secondly, grow some food. Grow some food and establish a relationship with the Black farmer. I'm so thankful for my wife because as a result of being on this lockdown, we have been growing food more than we had in the past, and that's largely by her efforts. But we need to get back to our roots and grow some food. This is something we always used to do. By the way, they food is killing us anyway. Got us with high blood pressure and sugar diabetes and obesity. Grow some food and go back to the earth and establish a relationship with a Black farmer. Number three, teach the children. That's what I do. That's my contribution to the movement. And you can learn more on my website about the different books and online programs that we offer. And lastly, brothers and sisters, protect your family. No, wait a minute. Don't get all deep and spiritual on me now. Listen, there is no virtue in allowing your family to be victimized. I want you to consider joining the National African American Gun Association. And I would like for you to protect your family. Now, listen, you're listening right now to a praying man. I believe in having a prayer covering over my home. But guess what? I believe in having a prayer covering over my car, but I got car insurance. We got home insurance. We got all these other things. Please don't get dumb, deep, and spiritual on me now when I'm talking about protecting your family. We are seeing massive acts of white terrorism, and we need to be prepared for whatever may come. Brothers and sisters, as I close, let me leave you with the words of John Henry Clark, who said, "Take what you do best and do it for your people." And finally, the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey said, "The dawn of a new day is upon us, and we see everything differently. We see not now as individuals, but as a collective whole, having one common interest." Brothers and sisters, I want to wish you a happy Juneteenth. I wish you peace, prosperity, love, joy, and health, and blessings beyond measure. My name is Dr. Chika Akua, and I approve this message. Peace and blessing.
Better days coming, Lord, by and by. Said, oh Lord, when we reach that city, Lord, way up in the said I'll be home at last. Said, oh Lord, when we reach that city, by and by, Lord, we don't have a good time, Lord, by and by. Well, oh Lord, when we reach that city, Lord, way up in the sky. My troubles will be over, Lord, and I'll be home at last. Oh Lord, when we reach that city, by and by, Lord, by and by.
The ship smelled death, blood, urine, feces. People piled on top of people. And my sister and I were tied together like mules. We ain't know what was happening. Did we do something wrong? We were royalty, but they were treating us like animals. While we were beat and abused, we would hold hands and cry. But one day, she ain't grabbed my hand. I called her name and she ain't answer. I yelled, but no one listened. I lay with her for 2 days before they cut us loose. My heart broke and a part of me died when they threw her in the sea. But I survived. When we got to the new land, they sold us like cattle. We stood there naked, and beaten to our souls. They named me Essie, but that ain't my name. I was more than that. They said I had good birthing hips, so that's what I did, birth babies. I think I got about 20. They all over town, different plantations. I got 3 by Massa, and they live in the big house. But they don't know I was their mom. And that hurt. The others stayed with me till they were about 4 or 5 before they were sold off. But sometimes I wish they would have just taken them out my arms. That would have been easier. But I survived. I had a man once. He was big and strong and beautiful. They called him Big John. He ain't know his real name, so I called him Bakari, one who will succeed, because he could do anything. Massa let us get married under the big oak tree. We jumped the broom. He ain't care about all the churn and that my body was broken down from all the birthing and working and beating. He said I was beautiful, and he called me Bahia. Then one day, he was gone. Massa sold him and sent him miles away. Said we thought too much of ourselves, calling each other different names and stuff. But we ain't never do that around Massa. So somebody told him. I ain't never find out who. But I survived. I was old now, and they let me work in the big house and help missus. I don't mind, because I get to see my churn, and I ain't got to work in them fields no more. But today, something amazing happened. We got word that we's free. General Granger said that the war was over, and we were free. I ain't tasted freedom so long, I don't know what that be like. But now, I can tell my churn that they my churn, and maybe I can find the other ones in Bakari. They say the other slaves been free more than 2 years. But I ain't worried about that. Because not everybody has to call me Bahia. No more Mammy Essie. I ain't worried about how long the other people been free. I just know I's free now. And I survived to see it. Thank y'all.
Come on, let's stand to our feet.